As I say, I'm one of the people at the College of Education, and it's been a pleasure working with Anna for the last several years. We managed to entice Anna down from Auckland. She was working on a project up there that I hope that she'll mention a little bit about, because it's an area that I'm interested in. She's looking at, with colleagues in Auckland, she was looking at dyscalculia and dyslexia. I'm interested in dyslexia, so I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit about the work that she's been doing along those lines. Before we enticed her down here in 2009, before she was at Auckland, she was doing work in France with a prestigious group of researchers over in France. And before that, she was in America. So although she's a New Zealander, unlike me, as you can probably tell from the accent, she's travelled widely, and that travelling has gained a level of experience of the topic that she's going to be talking about that I think we'll all find fascinating, because the groups that she's been working with have been looking at some very interesting elements of how we can look at parts of the brain and decide how that might inform learning and other elements such as attention and memory. And I'm hoping that Anna's going to inform me about those areas as well. So rather than me talking for any longer, I just want to finish by saying that hopefully we'll have about an hour of listening to Anna tell us about issues to do with neuroscience and education, and then we'll have some questions, hopefully about half an hour or so of questions, and then you're free to go. But that's enough of me. I'll sort of sit at the front and hopefully help out if need be, but that's enough for me. And final element is just to say, Dr. Anna Wilson, thank you for today's presentation.
Thanks, John, and thank you everybody for coming. I'm very honoured to have this many people who've come here to listen and to find out some more about the brain and education. That's awesome. So I'm going to give you a very general talk today, and most of the pretty pictures that I'm going to put up of the brain are not pictures that I myself produced, although this one is actually. I actually should maybe turn these lights down at the front. Here we go, that's a bit better. Sorry, are you too much in the dark there? No, all right? Okay, that will make it a bit easier to see these brains. But I have done a few snippets in this field, and I'll point those out. But mainly what I wanted to do was to give you all an introduction to this field of educational neuroscience, which is really quite new and exciting, and give you an idea of what it might be able to achieve, and also what some of the potential issues are. And we're going to do sort of a tour of some of the main findings or most interesting recent findings in the field. Okay, so you might, or I'm sure you will probably know that brain-based education seems to be one of the latest trends, and anyone who's worked in neuroscience kind of tends to start tearing their hair out as soon as you hear brain-based learning, because all learning is brain-based, otherwise it wouldn't be learning. So sometimes we're a bit skeptical about these trends, and probably with good reason too, because there's a lot of products that have flooded the market. Here's an example of some of them, and a few of those are some of the less reputable ones in terms of how much research background is actually behind them. And there's a lot of people out there selling things that they're calling brain-based, but when you actually look into the qualifications of the person, it turns out they don't even have an undergraduate degree in psychology, let alone a graduate degree in neuroscience or something similar. So you have to be a bit careful about what's out there, and also is it worth how much you're paying for it, which I'm sure some of you may already have an inkling of. And this is one of the reasons why John Brewer, who's one of the sort of early thinkers who contributed to this field when it was starting up in the mid-90s, which was just when I was starting university. And he initially claimed in 1997 neuroscience has little to offer teachers in terms of informing classroom practice, a very pessimistic conclusion there. And he argued that we should leave brain science alone and just go back to cognitive and behavioural studies, so pen and paper type, or maybe a few computer studies of learning, but that the brain stuff really didn't have anything which could apply to education at the moment. And he particularly expressed dismay at the predominance of what we call neuromyths, which are basically popular, very popular, but incorrect beliefs about the brain. And they tend to be based on misunderstanding of results that have come out, particularly sometimes by the press, or misinterpretation, and also sometimes over-extrapolation. People will take a kind of small finding in one area and then broadly apply it to all of thinking or all of the brain, and you can't really do that. So you might recognise some of these as ideas you've come across before. How many people knew that these were all incorrect? No, a few people. Okay, that's good. But most of you have probably thought that one of these was correct at one point, okay? And I won't go through all of them in great detail. To give you an example, one of the ones that's most popular, left brain versus right brain. So people are always talking about left brain thinkers and right brain thinkers, and left brain's logical and the right brain's creative. This doesn't really make sense based on what we know about the brain, either from brain structure or brain function, because the brain is massively interconnected. So this here in the middle is the corpus callosum, which is a band of fibers that connects the two sides of the brain, and it connects every point in the left brain to its homologous point on the right brain. So the left brain always knows what the right brain is doing. And actually a lot of this left brain, right brain kind of myth came from a series of patients who were, they're called split brain patients, and they had the corpus callosum either close to fully or partially severed in order to try and cure intractable epilepsy. So these people have a very unusual brain where their left and right is quite disconnected, which, however, this is not the case for our brains, okay? So almost everything that we're doing involves both sides of the brain. And another reason why maybe this neuromyth gets perpetuated is we often see pictures of the brain a bit like these nice coloured ones from brain imaging studies, which have these nice coloured blobs. So you see how there's some blobs here on the left, and there's more blobs on the left, and there's less blobs on the right, so that gives the impression that the left brain is doing a whole lot of stuff the right brain isn't. What you have to realise is these blobs are actually generated by a statistical threshold. So if the brain activity goes over a threshold, then you colour that bit in, basically. But if it's not coloured in, it doesn't mean that there's no activity. It just means that there was less activity. And so if you look at these actual pictures of the activity, you see that even when there's a big blob right here, there's a big blob on the other side too. It's just slightly less significant. Okay, so you have to be really wary with the brain research and looking at the findings, in that you see a picture that looks very complicated and seductive and sexy, but actually the research behind it is quite complex, and you have to be careful about drawing wide-ranging conclusions. And also that's not even to mention all of the methodology that goes into producing the blobs, which I'm not really going to go into so much. But suffice to say that you actually have to have a fair amount of expertise to be able to assess the validity of these studies if you were to be looking at reading through an actual brain imaging study. And so this is already one thing that makes it problematic using this information for education, because there's no way that we can be training up teachers or policymakers to be cognitive neuroscientists. They would have to do a master's degree at the very least, or a PhD, and we don't have resources to be doing that. It doesn't make any sense. So it's something to think about for later. Okay, so I've talked a bit about why we should be a little skeptical of brain research, and talked about all of the products out there and the neuromyths. So you may be wondering, well, hang on a minute, what's she doing here? Selling brain research to us? And why are we saying that now is a time when brain research is sort of coming into its own and we really need to be picking up and paying attention to it? What's different this time? So what's different now is that in the last 20 years, this field of cognitive neuroscience has emerged, and it's developed non-invasive, so non-dangerous or harmful methods for studying healthy brains, and particularly for studying in healthy brains while we're learning and thinking. And not just in adults, but also in children. So we have functional magnetic resonance imaging, which uses an MRI, a bit like you might have gone to the hospital to have a scan of a knee or a hip or something like that, or if nothing else, you've probably seen Dr. House use one of these on almost every episode. And these are used to produce the pictures of the brain being active. And basically, the way this is done is with a lot of complex physics that you'll be happy to know we're not going into. But it's basically possible because blood that is oxygenated, that has the oxygenated version of hemoglobin, has different magnetic properties to blood that is not oxygenated, deoxyhemoglobin. And that's how we're able to use this magnet to produce these images. And then also we have another method that I won't talk as much about, but this is called electroencephalography, and it's basically measuring brain waves and, in common parlance, and this is just measuring the electrical potential change on the scalp. So when your brain is active, part of its activity is electrochemical, but the electrical part of that produces enough of a signal that with very fine electrodes, and these are just electrodes that measure, okay, so we're not giving this poor little baby here a shock. We've just popped some nice sponges on his head that have little, really sensitive electrodes that can measure the electrical change in potential on the scalp. And that can give us an idea, a little bit of an idea about the location of brain activity, but especially the timing of brain activity. And at first it was quite hard to use this method, or actually either of these, for children, because one disadvantage is you have to be very still. And yes, as you know, small children are not so good at keeping still. But with some cunning behavioural training methods, they've managed to get quite good data out of this kind of study. So one centre I visited where a friend is working in New York, they have a mock brain scanner. So it looks like the real one, but it's fake. So it's nice and cheap in comparison. And they take children in there for training sessions. They lie the kids down, and the kids watch a video in there. I don't know, of SpongeBob or something, and they have motion sensors. And the minute they move, SpongeBob stops. So you wouldn't believe how quickly they learn to keep still. They really like SpongeBob. So it's ingenious little behavioural training method, and it works. So through methods like that, we can get kids to participate in these studies happily and get some good data on their brain activity. So there are currently hundreds and hundreds of studies going on, and so this is a graph of the number of studies coming out every year in developmental neuroscience, and you can see it's just going up and up. And people are looking at brain structure, brain function. They're also looking at the role of genes in brain development, so and particularly genes related to dopamine. So dopamine is involved in the reward circuit, they call it, in the brain, which helps us learn, essentially. So it makes us feel motivated about learning and enjoy learning. So they're looking at different alleles of genes that are related to dopamine and how this seems to affect brain activity and function. And also, they're now starting to look at interactions with the environment via what we call the epigenome. And I won't talk a lot about that, but if you haven't heard this term yet, the epigenome is the latest huge discovery in genetics, and it's basically a series of molecular switches which are coded in the part of the DNA that we previously thought wasn't doing anything, the so-called junk DNA, if you've ever heard that term. It turns out that that does code for something. It codes for switches that operate on our genes. And these switches are affected by the environment. So this is the mechanism by which genes can be turned off and on by the environment, and they're finding out in this field that this is happening a huge amount more than we ever realized. So there's not really anymore a nature versus nurture debate. There's a how do nature and nurture work together, and it turns out that it's quite detailed and complex, and we're only just starting to understand that. So they're looking at all of these kind of things in relation to brain activity. And there's a huge amount of data coming out. So that then is all part of this new field that's emerged that's called educational neuroscience. This is just an example. So there's academic and also books intended for the public coming out, academic journals, there's some societies. The OECD had a brain and learning project at some point. So it's in its early days, this field, but I think it will grow and grow. So when I was starting to study for my PhD was when, in the mid-90s, was when the field of cognitive neuroscience was just starting. And now that field is huge, and I think the same thing will happen with this educational neuroscience. Okay, so what I'm going to do then for most of the talk is take you on a bit of a tour of some of the findings. And like I said, most of these are not findings from my work, but a few tiny, very tiny snippets are, and I'll point them out. But it's findings of colleagues around the world who are contributing to this field. And of course, because it's not my work, I don't know all the minute little details, so I'm sure someone will manage to catch me in the half hour of questions afterwards, where I'll say, oh, I don't know, I'd have to go and look that one up. So we're just doing a very general tour of some of the most important things to know from this field, I guess. So one of the most important findings is, and I had this under the neuromyths, that remember I put one of the neuromyths was that the brain doesn't change. We now know that the brain changes a huge amount. So sometimes educators get nervous when they hear me talking about the brain, and I suspect it's because of this kind of deterministic idea that I might be, they think, oh, it's in the brain, that means it's fixed, it's genetic, and that's bad because that means we can't do anything. So this is not the case at all. So we know from this field that the brain changes a huge amount. So to give you an idea of some of the brain changes that have been looked at, there's quite a lot of work going on looking at brain development in utero. Okay, so this is what happens in the uterus in the very early weeks of development of the fetus. I'm trying to remember which weeks because I just told my child development class, I think it's weeks 4 to 8 or so. Right when mum's finding it hard to eat anything, this might be the body's way of protecting itself from environmental toxins that could affect the developing brain. And what's happening in the developing brain is we have our little precursor stem cells here, and they migrate out to form the layers of the eventual cortex. So the cortex is very complicated with these specialized cells in different layers. And it's amazing that this process, can work. The stem cells can migrate to the right place and then differentiate and turn into the right kind of neurons and take on the right function, make the right connections. And all of this is governed by genetics and hormones, which are also then, produced by the genes, and they travel along hormonal gradients. And so some of the genes, for instance, and we're a long way from knowing all of the genes that are involved in this, and the brain has 100 billion brain cells, so it's going to take a while. But for instance, some genes that are known to convey risk factors for dyslexia are already known to be involved in the cell migration process. And so this would explain why some risk factors for the fetus in utero, like drinking too much alcohol or also preterm birth, for instance, are often associated with learning difficulties. And we're expecting that we'll find other similar genes. What we don't know yet is how a gene that's involved in general cell migration can cause a specific difficulty like dyslexia. This is a bit of a mystery. But it may involve timing and epigenetics and that sort of thing. Okay, so another important thing to know about brain plasticity is that after birth, there is a huge amount going on in the brain. And children's heads grow a huge amount in the first couple of years of life. And one thing that's happening is they've got all their neurons at birth, but their neurons, so these little blobs are cell bodies, but they're not very connected up. And in the first 6 years, a huge number of connections are formed, if all goes well. And then over the course of the next 8 years or so, or sometimes even longer in some parts of the brain, these connections are pruned. And it's thought that through interaction with the environment, the brain is deciding which connections are useful, and we know that if connections are used, they tend to be kept, and which are not so useful, or which are not being used. They might be useful, but if the child is not using them in their current environment, then they might not get kept. And so this process is going on for a long time. So there is a huge amount of influence we can potentially have on the brain over the period of childhood. So this graph here, for instance, shows you this process here is the growth of synapses and then their pruning. And you can see for different parts of the brain, this occurs at different rates. So the sensory motor cortex here is the part of the brain that's involved in movement and vision and smell, touch, etc. And that process occurs very early there, between the first and second year of life. The parietal and temporal parts of the brain, so that's back here and down here, those are what's called association cortices, which pass information from sensory cortices to higher areas and integrate information. So that's occurring basically over middle childhood. And then the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that's involved in planning and decision making, is not maturing until the end of adolescence. Okay, anyone who's got a teenager at home will not be surprised to hear this, okay? This is a reason why your teenager can sometimes make some strange decisions or ignore your advice. And so this is another picture which shows this happening. So you can see if it's brightly coloured, that means there's a high rate of change. And at first, when children are really young, there's a high rate of change sort of mostly all over the brain. And then as they get older, the rate of change is really only up here in the frontal lobes. Until adolescence, you've got very little except in the memory systems there. Okay, so we know that there's a huge amount of change occurring in the brain over development, and we're starting to get an idea of the nature of that change, and this helps explain some of the behaviour that we see in different stages of development. And also, here's another study showing that so you might think, well, okay, but how do we know that that process is being influenced by the environment? And there are a lot of studies showing different influences. And so I just got this one for an example. I was trying to find ones with nice pictures, but I couldn't find any coloured pictures, so I had to go for this black and white one. So this one, they looked at the size of the motor or movement cortex in musicians, and they had musicians who, I think they were, see, now here's a detail I've forgotten, whether they were keyboard or string players. One of the two, I think they might have been string players. And they had musicians who had started learning at either a very young age, 3 or 4, all the way up to 10, also all the way through childhood. And they found that if you compare the musician right motor hemisphere, which controls the left hand, which in strings is doing a lot of fine-grained movement, you've got to be very accurate, otherwise your violin's not going to sound very good. They found that that was much larger in musicians than non-musicians. And they found that this correlated with the age that they started training. Okay, so that's very suggestive that musical training actually changed the motor cortex, the movement part of the brain in those people. And there are quite a lot of studies like this. So basically and also what I haven't put is a slide showing that there are studies showing quite a lot of brain change or plasticity even in the adult brain, which we also kind of know from recovery from stroke, right? So some people can recover very well from a stroke and regain function, but it doesn't always work so well. So one thing that's important in this plasticity field is getting an idea of there's clearly a lot of plasticity, but it clearly has some limits. And we don't, we're currently trying to find out exactly what the limits are. So this is one example actually of looking at those limits, the bilingual brain. This has been one big research area, especially as a huge number of people in the world, over half the world I think are bilingual, and we're becoming more and more bilingual. And I think it's especially interesting for here in New Zealand because we're multicultural but also bicultural society with the Treaty of Waitangi. And so it's interesting to know what this brain research is saying about language learning. And so there's been a lot of research done in all sorts of different languages, including not just spoken but sign languages, and looking at listening and speaking and motor for the sign language. and also looking at children from different socioeconomic backgrounds and using different brain methods. And so this is kind of a general summary of these findings. So basically you find that children who are exposed to the second language early in life, less than 5 years old, they perform very well in both languages, and so they don't have any noticeable difficulties in either language, as long as they keep using them. And they use the same brain areas as monolinguals for both of the languages. So this suggests that both of the languages sort of take on almost a native tongue type arrangement in the brain. However, what they find with late exposed bilinguals, later than 5 years, and we know that we already knew from non-brain research that they tend to have difficulties with grammar, and this is now explained somewhat by the brain research. We find that they've got much more distributed brain activity, so they're not just using the classical language areas. Sometimes it's more distributed right to left. So the language actually is quite lateralized. It tends to be, so both will be active, but the left hemisphere will often play a much bigger role. And it's thought to be kind of better at language. So then in these late bilinguals, you're finding that the hemispheres are playing more of an equal role, which might be that the right hemisphere is kind of trying to compensate or add capacity, but isn't probably able to do the job as well. And they also have to make more cognitive effort for processing the second language, and you can see that in the brain signature. However, both of the populations benefit from having two languages in that they show benefit in attention processing, which is really interesting. And this benefit seems to be seen later in life as well. And so there's also some research going on looking at the onset of dementia and whether being bilingual and practicing being bilingual can help offset that. You may have seen there's been a fair number of newspaper articles about that. So this is just showing that early bilinguals, you're not, so this is comparing them, the difference between them and non-bilinguals, and you don't see any difference. And then here with late bilinguals, you see quite a few differences, and it's irrespective of their proficiency in the second language. So it's not just to do with the skill, it does seem to be to do with the age at which they started learning. There's some limits on the brain, how much the brain can change. So for education, the implication is fairly obvious. We should be teaching children a second language really young. And here we are teaching most of our Pākehā kids in this country a second language when they enter adolescence, which is not actually what we should be doing in terms of the brain. And in France, where I lived, I used to watch them start learning English in school. They didn't start learning until maybe age 9 or 10, and even then only a few hours a week. And you just know, then knowing about the brain research, that their English will never be as good. And compare that to, say, Germany or the Scandinavian countries, their English tends to be a lot better than the French. The French should probably be the first to admit it, and that's because they start teaching it earlier. And we should maybe be thinking about teaching a second language to all kids, although it's difficult to get the resources to do that. But one thing we can know for sure is that kohanga reo and kura kaupapa, we should be really encouraging those and making sure that they're well supported and making sure that we're training enough teachers in Māori, because these schools are going to be really helping these children to learn well and to give them a cognitive advantage, and not to mention the kind of socio-cultural advantage from feeling more at home in that environment. And it's not going to, like all the research suggests, that going to school in Māori is not going to affect their English. In fact, it will make their English better in the long run. So, okay, so that's an idea of what's being done with language. You also might be surprised to hear that there's research going on the brain and socioeconomic status. Often, especially in academia, I think, and in education, people tend to think of the fields of psychology and sociology, or the sociocultural perspective on education, as being very separate, but actually there's a lot of work going on in the psychological field that's really relevant to sociocultural variables, like socioeconomic status. So they've already started to find that there are consistent brain differences which are associated with socioeconomic status in children, and they're mostly in, these are language-related areas, and where's number 2? Frontal areas, so executive control and attention. And this is just kind of a sampling of some of the work that's been done, just so you can get see that there's a fair number of studies out there. These are just sort of some of the best examples. So, and we already knew from non-brain work that we see big differences in kind of school-related skills that are related to socioeconomic status, but then we're also seeing that in the brain as well. We're seeing differences in attention function if we look at the brain waves, so that's the EEG work, and we're seeing differences in brain activity as well. I see some people frantically scribbling notes. I'm totally happy for slides to be available afterwards, so I'll find out from people how that can be done. So don't feel you need to try and write everything down. Might be a little impossible. Okay, and we're also studying, there's also studies looking at areas that are specifically known to be involved in reading and finding brain differences as well, reading and language. So how is this happening? I mean, obviously it can't be socioeconomic status itself. It's got to be factors that are associated with that. And that could be a number of different risk factors for brain development. So it could be prenatal factors. It could be parental care. You know, you've got parents who are much more stressed and finding it harder to provide for the basics for their kids. Look at all the talk about child poverty at the moment and children going hungry. And then cognitive stimulation as well. It also could be things like stress itself, so the level of stress present in the home, and we know that that's associated with socioeconomic status on average. Of course, this is always on average, but we know basically that this conveys some risk factors. Now, you might say, well, okay, that's just more evidence that we need to reduce inequalities in society and fix the problem of big differences in socioeconomic status. I'd be the first to agree with you, but I'd also probably be the first to say, well, you know, we've been trying to do that for a while, and we've only made limited progress, you know. So maybe what brain research can contribute is to try and identify some specific factors that are most likely to affect the brain, and we could be thinking about how to design and implement interventions or even advertising campaigns or whatever to try and target those specific factors, just like we do with health, for instance, for vaccinations or road safety or, okay, so the idea is to try and find some specific variables that might have quite a strong influence on the brain and see if by having a small influence there we can help improve things. I mean, of course, this is an idea in theory. It remains to be put into practice to see if it would work. But this has worked in the field of health, obviously. You know, we all have much better health today than we did 50, 100 years ago because of all of the health interventions that have been put in. And our road deaths have gone down and down over the last 50 years because of all the road safety features. And so this general approach could work, is the idea, without having to change the way the world works or overhaul the system of capitalism, which some of us would like to do sometimes, but it's also pretty difficult to do. Okay, so that's just an idea of what kind of research is happening there. There's also been a lot of work done on attention. So I've mentioned the frontal lobes and executive control and attention processes. So there's a lot of brain studies showing that when we do tasks that involve attention, this involves the frontal lobes, so that's pretty well known, and that's been known for some time. This is actually some of the first kind of research that was done in this area. I'm taking a swig of my Coke. I know it's naughty I have a Coke, but I'd like to point out that it goes with the UC branding. That was on purpose. Okay, so, all right, so for instance, we have an idea about, in terms of the development of the ADHD brain, we've got some nice structural studies now, for instance, showing that it's particularly the development of the frontal lobes which is delayed. And so this ADHD, attentional deficit hyperactivity, I should say. So it's known that kids who have difficulties with attention have frontal lobes that are developing slower. Of course, we don't know whether this is a cause or an effect of the attention difficulties, so that remains to be seen. But so then one of the next steps will be looking at how this changes over development and how environmental factors affect it, how genetic factors and epigenetic factors affect it. But already this research has started to be used, at least kind of experimentally, in terms of designing some scientific-based brain training, and that's just some simple computerized attention training. So this is one example of such a study where they have kids doing tasks that involve tracking objects, anticipating things happening. I think they have to track this cat that's not meant to go off the grass from memory, or recognise when there's a duck in the pond, or match the snakes. I'm trying to remember all the tasks. And so they're just doing very simple tasks that require attention and sustained attention. And they do this training for usually for an hour a day. This study they only did 5 hours, or 5 days rather, so it's quite short. And you can see cognitive changes with that. So the kids in this study showed an increase in their IQ scores, which is quite, well, no, I guess it's not surprising if they're probably just paying better attention to the IQ test. But that indirectly suggests an improvement in attention. And then when you get them to do an attention task, so this is the task that they did, which was just basically they see this little row of fish come up, and they have to press a key, left key if it's a left-facing fish like this one, or right key if it's a right-facing fish. And then there's distractor fish that either match like this one or they don't match. And plus there's a cue that can help them know where the fish are coming, or sometimes it's in the wrong place. And this task is a task that's known to kind of activate typical attention networks. And this is what an adult looks like when they're doing this task. So these are the brain waves, the electrical change over the scalp. And this is what the non-trained kids look like at 4 years and 6 years. And this is what they look like after training. At least at 6 years, the training made them look more like the adult pattern. Okay, so that's just one example study. There's a bunch of studies like that going on, which are basically looking at, well, the idea is to look at, well, let's test to see what are the best tasks that we can use to do this kind of training, and what produces what looks like the biggest and best change in brain activity, and then also looking, does that change maintain over time, et cetera, et cetera. So here's another example, and this was done with ADHD participants and non-ADHD, and it's just basically memory tasks. So the little buttons here flash in an order, and you have to reproduce the order by pressing the buttons, or you have to remember a sequence of digits and enter them in on here. And if you buy any of those brain training apps, has anyone purchased a brain training app? It's okay to admit to it. I think I downloaded a free one, and then it wanted me to buy stuff. So, but guess what? Lots of them have tasks like this in them. So, but guess what else? You can get these kind of tasks on the internet by probably paying a lot less than the brain training apps. So it might be worth having a search around before you buy. So training on this task increased brain activities in areas of the brain that we know are involved in spatial working memory. That's basically just remembering where things are in space, so remembering where the buttons, the order of the buttons to press. And so this is the change here, this is the increase in activity versus before the training, or after the training minus before the training. So this is the extra activity that we're getting. Although again, this is with you always have to do the statistical threshold, but that's just it's the only way to use that method. So, so there's definitely a bunch of studies out there like this which are suggesting that these training kind of programs can produce some changes in the brain, and again, we have to see what are the parameters around that, and how do they work, and do they maintain in the long term, and then also look at what changes they're producing in terms of actual educational outcomes. And some of the training programs have done this, so actually dyslexia would be the best example for that. This is just a picture showing you areas in the brain which a lot of studies have identified as being involved in dyslexia. So kids and adults with dyslexia show less brain activation in these three regions here, all of which are known to be important in reading. So they've been shown to be important to reading in normal reading subjects. And they're less active in dyslexia, and that's like highly replicable. And then here's an example of one study, which I failed to put the author of. This is Elise Temple. Luckily I did that for one I can remember the author of. In this study, they trained kids on mostly phonological type reading tasks, and they looked at brain activity before that kind of training. So here you can see there's not that much activity in these areas, these are areas which are typically activated during reading. Okay, in normal reading, these are the normal reading kids, so you can see there's a big difference here. You've got less activity in the kids with dyslexia, but then after training, these same regions here in the kids with dyslexia are showing more activity. Okay, so it looks like the brain training has changed these brains to be like the normal reading brains. Okay, again, we have to wait, to see, does this replicate with other studies? Does this hold? It's no use if it only lasts for 2 weeks. It needs to last for quite a long time. So there's a lot more work to be done to establish that this is definitely a useful method. But you can see the beginnings of this. And that this looks like it has quite some promise. And these are their scores on standardized reading tasks, which go up as well, and that's highly significant. And they knew that this program was very good. So with this kind of methodology, though, we can start to look at, should we put in interventions like this very early for children, which is almost certainly the answer is probably yes, as opposed to later. So then like with the bilingual research, we can look at the parameters around that, and when. We could also look at when we could look at normal instruction, for instance. So if I go back a couple of slides, if I go back to this slide, actually, no, wait, I will go forward, because in this slide, this shows you some research which has been recently identifying an area in the temporal cortex, this area of the brain down here, which gets specialized to recognize whole words. It obviously hasn't evolved to do that over the course of evolution, because reading is much too recent a cultural task, but it appears that this, we know that this area in the inferior temporal lobe is specialized for recognizing objects of various types, which is a task that we've all had to do or the human race has had to do over the course of evolution. And it appears that we're able to somehow reuse or recycle, recruit this area to do this new cultural task of recognizing words. So have you ever wondered why kids write letters backwards sometimes? Have you ever seen a child do that and think, oh no, might have dyslexia? Okay, good news, writing letters backwards is not a symptom of dyslexia. It's a normal stage that all kids go through. And one of the reasons why is because this area of the brain is specialized for recognizing objects, And guess what? It doesn't matter out in the African savannah if you have a left-facing tiger or a right-facing tiger, you know, just run, okay? You need to recognize it's a tiger and run fast, all right? So there's a good evolutionary reason for us to not pay attention to the orientation of objects, and then children, when they learn to read, they have to learn to overcome this. So that's why they write B as D. Okay, you can be sure that it's their savannah survival instinct that's kicking in when they do that, and there's nothing wrong with them. Okay, all right. So also you can see then the potential for these methods to inform teaching methods. Okay, so if we look at, for instance, the whole word versus phonics debate. Okay, so we now know which areas in the brain are related to whole word recognition, which areas are related to phonics, these two, and we could start looking, once we have the developmental study information, at when in the normal course of development of reading did these areas start being used, when are they used the most, what kind of instruction gets them used the most, and also by looking, of course, in conjunction with educational research. So we could say, well, okay, we know this instruction seems to be the most effective, so let's have a look at why, and let's see if we can use that information to tweak things about the instruction or to inform other areas, other related areas of instruction. So I think there's a lot of potential for informing how regular teaching is done in the classroom. People have focused a lot in this field on learning difficulties, and that's partially because we want to help with problems in society, you know, but the information that we're finding out could be useful for teaching all children. So it's also because this is a good way to, these learning difficulties are also quite helpful to find out about how the brain works sometimes too. So one of the kind of possibly slightly science fiction dreams of this area is to find what they call biomarkers. They just use that word because they want to have a scientific, fancy-sounding word, but that's just the idea that there might be something detectable, for instance, in the brain that we could use as an early marker to say, oh, this kid is likely to have trouble with dyslexia or trouble with maths, dyscalculia, which is what we're going to do next. And we're starting to get studies which are looking at that. So this is an example from colleagues in Finland, the study that's been done in evascular, and it's particularly impressive because they found that brainwaves measured at 6 months could predict reading at age 7, which is super impressive. But the difficulty is at the moment it's still sort of at the experimental stage because we need to find out, it needs to be sort of highly predictive in that it needs to have lots of hits. We get a correct prediction, but not too many false alarms. You know, we can't be telling parents when their children are that age, oh, might have risk of dyslexia when that's not going to happen, when it's a false alarm. Okay, so you have to get a test that's very specific and doesn't have too many what they call misses, cases that it fails to identify or false alarms before you can use it. So at the moment, it's a case of trying to find something that could work that well. And it remains to be seen if that can be done. So, yeah, we'll find out in the long run. Okay, so the final topic I'm going to talk about is the topic that I research, although I still didn't produce this picture myself. We'll get to one I did in a minute. And it's looking at how the brain represents maths and number. And what we've found out in that field is starting to kind of catch up with the dyslexia field. But people like John who work in dyslexia have a big head start on me because that field's been working for maybe 30 or 40 years prior. And, but we have a fair idea now that there's a particular area of the brain called the intraparietal sulcus. That's this area here. It's kind of a groove that's around about here on your head on both sides. You won't be able to feel it. I see a few people trying to feel it. It's inside. And this part of the brain lights up when we're doing tasks related to numbers. Okay, and particularly tasks that are related to quantity. So if you're just looking at a display like this quickly and saying this one has more dots, you can do that without counting if the difference is big enough. If you're comparing numbers, subtracting, you're approximating or estimating, all of these quantity-based tasks seem to activate this brain area. And we know from developmental studies now, so this is brain imaging in 4-year-olds, that the same brain area is activated. It looks a little messier in the kids. You can see their brains are a lot littler, but it's essentially the analogous area. And so we're starting to get an idea from this study and quite a few others how that brain area might develop. And there's particularly studies looking at how it changes once children start to go to school and learn about numbers. And of course, what goes wrong in dyscalculia, what goes wrong when, so dyscalculia is basically a bit like dyslexia but for maths. Kids with dyscalculia really struggle with understanding what numbers mean and being able to do things like when they're younger, choose the bigger number or add 7 plus 8. It's quite a struggle for them to, okay, 8 can break down into 3 and 5 and then that's 10 plus 5. That's easy for us to do quickly, most of us, but for a kid who has dyscalculia, it's a real struggle. And the numbers just basically don't sort of seem to mean as much to them. They also have trouble remembering times tables. They're slower to just decide which number is bigger than another. And even when kids with dyscalculia grow up and become adults, they still report having, so one of the studies I've been involved in that John mentioned was work up in Auckland with Professor Karen Waldy, and we looked at a group of adults with dyslexia, dyscalculia, both or neither. And when we talked to our adults with dyscalculia, they reported that it was really stressful, even things like shopping and trying to figure out whether they had too much in their basket, what it was all going to add up to, or seeing a discount sign and figuring out what that was going to cost, or reading a percentage in the newspaper. They found it didn't mean much to them. We had one lady in our study who was a manager at work, and she said that the budgets were the thing that she really struggled with because they didn't make any sense to her, and she couldn't admit it because she was a manager, and so it'd be embarrassing. So she had a person at work who was in the know that she had number dyslexia, and she would meet with her friend before the meeting, and her friend would explain the budget to her, and then she'd be able to go in the meeting and pretend that she had understood the budget all along, and no one would be any the wiser. And you should have seen the emails that this woman wrote, incredibly well written. She said, you know, I was always top of the English class, and she was very, very good at language, but she had a specific difficulty with number. So even though this may be news to you, this dyscalculia thing, it does exist. It's also my party trick. People ask what I do, and I have to explain, you know, I study dyscalculia, what's that? And then 50% of people are like, oh, I think I have that. And then I have to explain that just because you had trouble at school with algebra and calculus, it doesn't necessarily mean it's dyscalculia. It's just that no one likes calculus. But anyway, so getting back to the brain studies, there's already studies which, and there's some more recent ones that I just ran out of room on my slide. But these are some of the first ones that came out showing differences in the dyscalculic brain, and it seems that there's some structural differences in the interparietal sulcus, and this is actually showing a structural one as well. It's less well organised in this group. This is Turner's syndrome women, and this Turner's syndrome is often accompanied by difficulties with maths and spatial cognition. This part of the brain also deals with space, by the way, and also less brain activation whilst doing number tasks. So there's a good suggestion that this might be a core kind of potentially cause or at least correlate of dyscalculia, and then so the research is trying to look now at the developmental trajectory of that. Although it also could be that brain region, so we don't know whether it's the region itself or whether it's more the connections that go to the region, and that those connections don't get set up in the course of learning very well, and that's quite important for knowing how early we could pick it up. But anyway, I won't get into the details of that. I can always answer some questions on it. Okay, so just so I can put a picture of something that I did do, this is my software, the Number Race, which so it's one of these brain training softwares that I developed in France with the big famous chap who I worked with there, who's called Stanislas Dehaene, and he's done a lot of work on reading in the brain and maths in the brain, and this software was basically designed to try and train the brain area that I've been talking about that we know is involved in number sense. And it worked fairly well in that we got some kind of initial changes in that area, but we didn't see a huge amount of generalization in the early version, so we now have a kind of new and improved version, which a master's student of mine who's sitting right up here, Patricia, has been testing here in Christchurch, and we're soon going to have results from that. There's also a follow-on piece of software and etc., but I won't spend hours talking about that. So just to say that there is some brain training software for that as well. And then here is another picture I produced. It's the last one, I think. And this is just from the brain study I was talking about up in Auckland, looking at dyscalculia and dyslexia in adults. And in this study, we were looking at learning disabilities that co-occur, or a comorbid, just means co-occur basically. And we're still sort of finalizing results, so this is a bit preliminary. But one finding, so we found, or at least we think we found the normal kind of underactivity in brain areas associated with dyslexia and dyscalculia that other studies had found, although that has to be finalised too. But we're particularly interested in these individuals who have both and what's different about their brains. And one thing we found that's quite interesting is that they have to use their frontal cortex a lot more. They have to use a lot more of their attention and kind of control mechanisms. And potentially this may be because they have, I guess, if they have two difficulties or two parts of the brain or brain networks that aren't working as well, they basically have to kind of compensate more. And we could see this in terms of when we gave them memory tasks to do, they did less well on these tasks. So also this helps make a prediction about what kind of intervention kids with both learning difficulties might need. We know from this kind of research, or at least it suggests, that they might also need extra help with executive control and attention and all those things that involve the frontal lobes, because their poor old frontal lobes are basically having to go into overdrive to compensate for the two difficulties. So that's the theory anyway. It's a bit preliminary, like I said, but it looks nice. They have also done research showing in this field, and then this goes back to the, we need to always, play devil's advocate and be skeptical. So one thing that they've shown is that if you give a scientific presentation, whether that has some facts and some inaccuracies in it. So when they did the experiment, that's what they did to sit and then see if people would notice the inaccuracies. People are more likely, or they got people to rate how convinced they were, and people were more convinced when there were brain pictures. Even when the brain pictures weren't actually relevant to the presentation itself or didn't even add. And so I'm just warning you guys, okay, don't be seduced by the brain pictures. Make sure to still engage the brain and decide what you think. But yeah, it's quite funny that they did this research. And this is something that is relevant to teachers and ensuring that teachers can be critical consumers of this research, because this goes a bit of a way to explaining how it's been so easy for all of these products based on kind of neuromyths to make it into the market. So some of those books that I popped up earlier on, Brain Gym or the David Sousa, the Eric Jensen books, they sell really well, even though they're full of inaccuracies. I think just the fact that they have the brain pictures, and it sounds scientific-y, And they've shown that just doing one course isn't enough for students to be able to discriminate either. So I'll come back to that in a second. Now I've been talking about, I actually am starting to wrap up now, good news. I've been talking about a lot of potential applications of this research as we go along, so I think I've already covered that one. I think this is a possibility for, I don't know that we'd ever be able to completely level things out, but in terms of the risk factors that I was talking about, I think I've also mentioned the curriculum and how this kind of research maybe could inform some of these big educational debates that go on. And also, it could be influencing industry, and some of the better products are being well influenced by the research, but one way to make sure that those products are better influenced by the brain research is to have more of an exchange between the research and also between educators and between the products, the companies that are making these kind of products, and that's not happening as much at the moment, which is a bit of a shame. So what about teachers in particular? And this is one thing that's very important, because teachers are the people who could be most immediately applying findings, even though, as you see, at the moment we still have to be cautious about what we can decide to conclude from things. But I think what particularly we should be preparing for is what's going to happen with this research. After 10, 15 years, we're going to have so much more knowledge about this field, because it's, as you saw, it's increasing a huge amount. So we need to be preparing our teacher trainees now to be critical consumers of this information in 20 years' time or so, when there will be a huge amount of this information out there. And you can see that some of my colleagues in the cognitive neuroscience field have some quite radical proposals about how this would be done, but I don't think that's very, I'm not sure that that's realistic in terms of, I don't think we can be literally training teachers in cognitive neuroscience, because they have a lot of things they have to study for initial teacher training, and to, like I was saying, to actually train in cognitive neuroscience, it's a lot of study. But I definitely think that one thing we could be doing is get past that one course point. So I was saying that, they've shown that one course isn't enough. So we need to be getting 4 or 5 psychology courses into the average teaching training 3-year degree. Or if teacher training goes to postgraduate, we need to be taking, at least obviously postgraduates are then going to come from all sorts of sources, but that then gives the potential for some of them to be coming from psychology, where they would have had a lot more of these courses. And I think that would really help increase just the base knowledge of the profession about the brain. And many teachers are going out to give teachers. I'm really amazed when I go to schools and interact with them and do, every now and then I do a bit of professional development around dyscalculia and learning disabilities, and I'm amazed how active and curious they are about this area, and they're racing out there and getting books and learning stuff. So teachers are doing a lot of professional development on their own, but I definitely think we could be starting off with the initial trainees to give them a sound knowledge of psychology and a good base to build on, and an idea of which, that this is the right path to follow to get the correct information and avoid the neuromyths over here, and that's one of the main things that we could be doing. Okay, so I have reached the end almost, so I've got just some information here for you, for hopefully you can get a copy of the slides later. If nothing else, I can email them to people, but hopefully they'll be able to put them up on the web for me maybe. So some good websites to go to learn about this field. They've been vetted by me and they're all okay. And this is particularly the Brainwave Trust, because it's a New Zealand trust that's been formed to try and get this information out to the New Zealand public. Some recommended books. These are all kind of popular psychology type books that are easy to read for people new to, you don't need to have an academic background to read them. Anyone who's here from the university who would like to consult the academic references, they're here. I think I pretty much got them all. I was doing this at the last minute, so if there's a couple missing, that's my bad, but most of them are there. And this is just advertisement for next week. And now we're on to question time.